Thank you for coming. This talk, I'm going to preface by saying Louise Bourgeois' work is quite challenging. This has been probably one of the most challenging talks for me to put together because of the content of it. I feel kind of really challenged by the, been a long time since I read Freud, like back in college. So the material that she is exploring is very powerful. She is a brilliant artist, but not easy. So, you know, the Calder stuff that we did last week was like a walk in the park in comparison to where we're going today. Okay, so you may not like the work, but there is a very profound depth to it. So here we go. Known for her idiosyncratic style, Louise Bourgeois was a pioneering figure of the 20th century and early 21st. A prolific sculptor, printmaker, draftsman, painter, Bourgeois is linked with surrealism and feminist art, though she developed a singular voice that betrays categorization to a specific art movement. Her artworks have been widely understood as focused on subjective states such as loneliness, jealousy, pride, anger, fear, love, and longing. Employing diverse materials, including metal, fabric, wood, plaster, paper, and paint in both intimate and monumental scales. She used recurring themes and subjects: animals, insects, architecture, the figure, text, and abstraction as form and metaphor to explore the fragility of relationships and the human body. Bourgeois' work is in major institutional collections around the world, including the Museum of Modern Art, National Gallery in Washington, D.C., and the Pompidou Center, and the Tate. She has actually had retrospectives in the Museum of Modern Art twice, and the Guggenheim, the Tate, and several others, actually, the Pompidou Center, I believe. So this lady has had a lot of exposure in her time. Okay, let's see. Louise Bourgeois was born on December 25th, 1911 in Paris to Louis Bourgeois and Josephine. Her parents ran a tapestry gallery and restoration atelier, repairing and selling medieval and Renaissance tapestries and antiques. Bourgeois' father was mobilized in World War I, and in 1916, Louise and her mother traveled to visit him in the hospital when he was wounded. And she was very young at that point, you know, 5 years old. So that's a very traumatic thing to go and visit your father in hospital at that age. Toward the end of the war, the mother contracts Spanish flu and never fully recovered. Bourgeois' education in 1921 was interrupted frequently by going to care for her mother. In 1922, Sadie Gordon Richmond is hired by Bourgeois' father as an English teacher for his children. She was 17 at the time and was actually kind of companion, sort of au pair. She becomes his mistress and lives with the family. So there's a kind of fundamental betrayal going on there from this friendship into her becoming the mistress of the father. And you can see the picture that's over to the left, which is including her, Sadie. Okay. So Bourgeois uses her drawing skills to help out at the tapestry workshop. She becomes an expert in drawing legs and feet. Bourgeois' mother, Josephine, dies in 1932. She receives her baccalaureate in philosophy and enters the Sorbonne, studying solid geometry and differential calculus. So we're talking about one brilliant lady here. This woman's accomplishments are really remarkable. In 1933, depressed by her mother's death. Now, she was very close to her mother. Her mother was a great source of strength for her. Even in the face of the betrayal with the father and the mistress, living under the same roof, she was able to hold the family together. And when she died, Louise became depressed, abandons math to study art. 36 to 38, Bourgeois takes courses at École des Beaux-Arts and art history classes. She becomes a docent at the Louvre, and actually during this time, she starts to study and becomes a studio assistant to Ferdinand Liger, the great cubist. And here is a piece from 1946 by Louise Bourgeois, and you can see on the right one of Liger's pieces from 1954. You can see how the cubist influence is there. Bourgeois opens her own gallery in a section of her father's tapestry gallery. She sells prints and paintings by Delacroix, Matisse, Rodin, Velledon, and Bonnard, among others. Bourgeois marries an American art historian, Robert Goldwater, and they move to New York. In 1939, Bourgeois and Goldwater returned to France, arranged for the adoption of a French orphan, and Bourgeois comes back to America and enrolls in the Art Students League and begins making prints in addition to producing paintings and drawings. In 1940, Bourgeois' adopted son arrives in New York in May, and she gives birth to her second son, Jean-Louis, that summer. She starts making wood sculpture in 1941 on the roof of her apartment building. And so she was working out in the open air and all of that. In 1945, Bourgeois has her first solo show, Paintings by Louise Bourgeois in New York. And begins exhibiting in group shows with the abstract expressionists, including Pollock, Rothko, de Kooning, and Motherwell. Bourgeois was included in a group show, The Women, at Peggy Guggenheim's Art of the Century Gallery in that year. So she's getting exposure at that point. And you can see these pieces on the on the right. Now, she has been identified with the surrealists, but she did not care for those men because they did not really acknowledge her existence in a certain way. The surrealists were very chauvinistic, and really kind of discounted the women that were working in the idiom that they were working at that point. But you can see these pieces on the right are really interesting pieces, and it's really, we're going to go more into this Le Feminism business, which is where the house replaces the head of the woman. But we'll go into more depth into this now. Well, let's go here. In 1949, Louise Bourgeois' recent work, 1947 to 1949, 17 standing figures in wood is the artist's first solo show of sculpture. And you can see those pieces in installation shot. Both of these shots are from that show. And they're very interesting pieces using mixed media, wood, metal, paint, fabric. And we'll go into more depth on the the standing figure aspect of these pieces as we go on. Bourgeois opens a bookshop, Emeritus Books and Prints, which she'll run until December of 1959. She becomes an American citizen in 1957 and starts experimenting with organic forms and more fluid materials, such as plastic, latex, and rubber. So you can see her below with Life Flower, a piece that's in progress. Above on the right, from 1954, you can see her with Robert Rauschenberg, who was kind of fresh on the scene at that point. At this point, I'm going to start to talk a little bit about the psychological aspect of what Bourgeois was up to. The multiple heads. This middle piece on center screen is her piece, and she's using her experience from her childhood, dealing with textiles and dealing with fabric, and basically sewn and beaded and using these different elements, and then these multiple heads. Now you see the Picasso on the left, where he is doing the multiple points of view of Mary Therese. This is something that Bourgeois is engaged in, and multiple personalities, aspects of the personality, different elements put together, the male, the female. The piece on the photograph on the bottom on the right is a photograph of Marcel Duchamp in drag in 1921. Now, dealing with these kinds of issues at that time was pretty radical. And one of Duchamp's combined mixed media pieces, called The Bride Stripped Bare by Her Bachelors, this large glass piece, which actually you can see some of the shattering of the glass. In actuality, that happened in transit at one point, and he loved the shattering of the glass so much that he kept it and didn't try and replace that. But Duchamp was dealing with the male-female issues, the gender issues, the crossing of gender, and what does that mean, and the performative aspect of it. Okay. So in her first solo show at 11 years, now see, she stopped showing for 11 years when she was in the depth of her analysis. The analysis really went from for a period of time from the time of her mother's death until the 60s, but she was really in deep analysis during that period of time. Now, one of the things that I want to say at this point, and I'll go into more depth on it, is Louise Bourgeois was an interesting character. She used analysis as a way to get to find material to work from. She really was using that as her subject matter. So it was not about trying to find some remedy to the dilemma of her issues. It was really about exploring them and learning about them, analyzing them, rather than therapy as a tool to transcend or work with those traumas. She was using it as the material of her work. So in her first solo show in 11 years, Bourgeois Recent Sculpture, Bourgeois exhibits a new body of work in plaster and latex. Bourgeois' work is shown alongside younger generation of artists such as Eva Hesse, Bruce Nauman, in a seminal exhibition, Eccentric Abstraction, at Fishbeck Gallery in New York, organized by Lucy Lippert, who is pretty well-known art historian and curator of the time. On the right, you can see Eva Hesse's Ring Around a Rosie, which really is dealing with, you know, the breast, the material that she used was very unconventional, you know, basically pencil, acetone, varnish, enamel paint, ink, cloth covered electrical wire, and paper mache on masonite. So Eva Hesse really was the, you know, she looked at Bourgeois' work and was someone who was inspired by it to create her own groundbreaking work, and they showed together at that time. So it's really interesting to note that. I mean, this is, you know, Bourgeois in her well into her 50s has been showing for, you know, 30 years at this point, and she's showing with these young avant-garde artists in the 60s. Okay, Bourgeois makes her first trip to Italy to work from marble and bronze, and returns repeatedly over the next 5 years. The piece on the right is from the marble that she got from when she was in Italy, and then this collage on the left is really something that's a very powerful piece. You know, 1973, Bourgeois' husband dies. So this is a pretty powerful collage in a certain way. Louise usually worked on a series, often returning over many years to familiar themes such as Femme de Maison, with new materials and new ideas. You saw a couple of those earlier when I was showing you through things. So that from as early as the 30s, she was working on this theme. When asked how she knew a piece was finished, Louise said, "It's never finished. The subject is never exhausted." So you can see this business. The Femme de Maison is a series of paintings and sculptures in which Bourgeois explores the relationship of a woman and the home. In the works, women's head have been replaced with houses, isolating their bodies from the outside world, keeping their minds domestic. So you can see is how she was really, you know, this was early on in the 30s and 40s, where she was dealing with these very profound feminist issues that were coming to the fore in the 60s, 70s, and 80s much more. Although, of course, the feminist movement was going on from the 1800s. Very interesting materials. And here is Miriam Shapiro's kind of homage to to Bourgeois. Miriam Shapiro worked with a lot of quote unquote female materials. She did a lot of work with quilts and things like that, but dealing with feminist issues. And again, you know, dealing with the psychological in different ways. Kusama, with her room full of phalluses, dealing with her childhood trauma in her own way, really addressed this. Now, Kusama, you know, really kind of tried to use it as a therapeutic remedial thing, where I don't see that with Bourgeois. Bourgeois was not trying to get to transcend that experience. She was diving in deeper and deeper as the years went on. And Niki de Saint-Phal, again, had profound childhood trauma and transformed it into a really different kind of work, nonetheless monumental, but you know, her way of dealing with it was a very different course. Okay, the feminist issues that were up and at it, you know, the Guerrilla Girls in 1989. Do women have to be naked to get into the Met Museum? Less than 5% of the artists in the modern art sections are women, but 85% of the nudes are female. And then this great, if you keep women out, they get resentful. It's a great one. Okay, and this is Judy Chicago's dinner party. And what it is a series of these ceramic plates with these rather vaginal depictions of the different artists and literary figures, and leaders of basically Sojourner Truth, you know, leaders of the abolitionist movement. There's various literary figures seated around the table. Now, this piece is in the Brooklyn Museum on permanent display. So if you get over there, you'll get to see it. It's really fabulous and hysterical. Okay. In 1974, in a solo show, Louise Bourgeois sculpture, 70 to 74, Bourgeois exhibits the destruction of the father. And in this piece, basically, I actually will do a close-up on this, but the viewer stands in the aftermath of a crime, set in a stylized dining room with the dual impact of a bedroom. The abstract blobs, like children of an overbearing father, have rebelled, murdered, and eaten him. So if you get a look at the table here, let me zoom in, you'll see that there are, well, it's kind of hard to see. They actually are kind of rubber chickens that have been painted and all that. And you know, these children look a little, to me, knowing what's coming, a little like spider eggs. So you know, there's a very sardonic humor that goes with this stuff, but it's very intense. Bourgeois received an honorary doctorate of fine arts at Yale University in '77 and exhibited at Xavier Foucault, which is a very reputable gallery. It was the gallery that represented de Kooning and Joan Mitchell and a bunch of the really big name artists at the time. Bourgeois acquires a studio in Brooklyn, which allows her to work much larger scale. In 1982, Louise Bourgeois Retrospective, curated by Deborah White, opened at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. The show travels to Houston, Chicago, and Ohio. This is really the big breakthrough in Louise Bourgeois' work. After this point, she is included in the higher echelons of what's considered, you know, kind of the blue chip artists in the country. She's represented by basically the top galleries in London, in Paris, in New York, and around the world. And it's interesting because she never did her work for that purpose. She didn't have the kind of ambition that somebody like Kusama had. Her intention was to do her work and explore the depths of this work and put it out there in the world. And Deborah, really, the curator at the Museum of Modern Art, had to go to her studio and dig around in the archives, you know, in the basement of her building and in her studio in Brooklyn, in order to really archive the work and to put together this retrospective. It was really a great, how can I say this? A partnership between them. And so, okay, what I'm showing down below is a series of pieces that, you know, basically this ancient Greek Perm figure, which is basically identified with the phallus. You know, there are much more obvious ones. I did not pull those out, but next to that is a Giacometti, and these three Giacometti standing figures, standing people in a field. Next to that is a Brancusi, bird flying into space. On the left is a Bourgeois, brother and sister. Again, these kind of phallic shapes, but this one is a combination. It's also vaginal. You know, if you look at it, there's the phallus, but there's also the vagina. There's this whole notion of incest, of the standing together. There's a lot here. This is beyond my depth. The psychological elements of her work is really powerful, and there is a talk with Deborah White and two actual psychotherapists psychoanalysts who discuss Louise Bourgeois' work in a lot more depth than I'm capable of. So you may want to search that one out. It's definitely out there
Larry,
on YouTube. Yes.
Before you go on, how big are the brother and sister?
What?
How do you know how big they are, the brother and sister sculptures?
No, they aren't huge, because those were from 1949. So it was before she had her bigger studio space. So they stand probably, no taller than 5 feet tall.
Thanks.
Okay. And all the way on the right is listening one. And this is kind of a dialogue between these two standing figures, and it's that interaction. It's really interesting. One is more phallic than the other, though there are these eggs that are attached to it, and there are holes in the other one. I'm not going to go any further. We're moving on. So along with these sculptures, she was constantly drawing and doing these sketches. They are from her dreams. There's writings that go along with it. Somebody asked her if she had ever been in therapy, and she denied it. And years later, one of her assistants dug up years and years of writings that she had written down during her analysis. And when she was asked about this, she said, "Oh yes, I was in analysis for many years." The implication of that is never in therapy, always in analysis. So, the interpretation of these pieces I will leave to you, but they are kind of labyrinth and web, and we're going to move on. Labyrinths, spools of yarn, webs, snakes, entry into the underworld, into the unconscious. And she's constantly doing these fabric pieces. She actually, in her Brooklyn studio, had a full-time fabricator who was working on sewing these pieces. So she was constantly working the fabric, the tapestry, the remnants from that. And you see Saint Sebastian from Montaigne here, And these are the female versions of Saint Sebastian. And this note on the left, entry into the labyrinth here, and writings. I haven't even tried to read the thing. I read some of her writing, and it is very profound, worth looking at. We're not doing too much of that here because we don't have much time. So I'm going to move on. Mammon. Okay. I'm a little phobic of these pieces. To tell you the truth, they're pretty terrifying. I have seen one of these. I've walked under one of them. They had one of them up at Storm King years and years ago. They're terrifying pieces to me, but what they mean to her is something totally else. So we'll talk about that. Mammon is a series begun in the 1990s and alludes to the strength of her mother with metaphors of spinning, weaving, nurture, and protection. The prevalence of the spider motif in her work has given rise to her nickname as Spider Woman. This is a quotation. "The spider is an ode to my mother. She was my best friend. Like a spider, my mother was a weaver. My family was in the business of tapestry restoration, and my mother was in charge of the workshop. Like spiders, my mother was very clever. Spiders are friendly presences. They eat mosquitoes. We know that mosquitoes spread diseases and are therefore unwanted. So spiders are helpful and protective, like my mother." So a very different take and a very different integration of that power of these figures, of what this meant to her. You know, that terrifying figure to me is a source of power and strength to her. Okay. While in her 80s, Bourgeois produced two series of enclosed installation works she referred to as cells. Many are small enclosures into which the viewer is prompted to peer inward at arrangements of symbolic objects. Others are small rooms in which the viewer is invited to enter. In the cell pieces, Bourgeois uses earlier sculptural forms, found objects, as well as personal items that carried strong personal emotional charges for the artist. The cells enclose psychological and intellectual states, primarily feeling of fear and pain. Bourgeois stated that the cells represent different types of pain: physical, emotional, psychological, mental, intellectual. Each cell deals with a fear. Fear is pain. Each cell deals with the pleasure of the voyeur and the thrill of looking and being looked at. So having been to this thing, there's a claustrophobic aspect to these pieces. You're inside, you're seeing through them, you're seeing other people walking around them. There's the voyeur aspect, but there's also the kind of element of the enclosure, of the sense of being a prisoner of these things. And there are mirrors throughout, so you catch glimpses of yourself inside the enclosures. And actually, that building that's inside that enclosure with the guillotine over the top of it was the building that the Tapestry Factory and their home was housed in France. And again, there's this kind of reliquary quality to these pieces. You know, they're contained inside these glass orbs, the bones from their history. And, you know, again, the fabric, the weaving, the pulling together, the knitting together of memory, of that experience, of looking back and exploring it from different directions, from different points of view, from now, looking back on that. And what does that become? How does that change? How is it altered by the experience of viewing it this way? And this is, these pieces that I'm showing you now are in the exhibit at the Jewish Museum. So this vitrine actually holds a bunch of these smaller pieces, and a number of the pieces that I've shown you are actually in that show. It's not a large show. It's one gallery, one floor in the museum. But, you know, for my money, a small dose of this work is well worth the visit. I don't know how I would respond to a full-on retrospective. I didn't get to see those when they happened. There was one that was in 2017, 2018 at the Museum of Modern Art. I did not see it at the time, but this show is well worth a visit if you're of a strong enough disposition. Okay. This is one of the plates, nameplates that's on the wall, one of the descriptions on the wall of the exhibition. The hysteric suffers mainly from reminiscences. The whirlpool of hysteria follows a kind of voidification that goes faster and faster, stronger and stronger. It's the intoxication. We rush toward our death because the fear is unbearable. Oh God. This lady is something else. It's very profound work. She was very courageous in her ability to go into this and come back out and produce this work. It was for her a grounding thing. One of her quotes is, "Art is a guarantee of sanity." I don't know. It was a guarantee of her sanity, I guess. And, you know, again, these are some more of her fabric pieces, which are just on display in this show. And then, you know, we go back into this business of the intertwining of the figures, the kind of incestuous relationship within her family. You know, the mistress, the father, the mother, the brother, and she, the whole intertwining. And again, I pulled up this Rodin figure, and if you look at it next to this couple that was the cast polished sculpture from 2007 to 2009 by Bourgeois. It's a very interesting relationship, and you can see where there was an awareness of the history and a reinterpretation of that. There's a whole series of these hand pieces reaching out and never quite touching. or some touching and embracing and holding. I saved a tapestry from the moth destruction the way one saves a soul. The salvation spirit, dedication, evangelical zeal. She burns with evangelical zeal. The loss of innocence and the cost of sainthood. Sacrifice at your cost, not mine. Save the days. I want to serve. I need to serve. I live for serving, or feel worthless. And this is a collaged piece, untitled. And here is Louise Bourgeois and one of her sculptures hanging in a gallery. I don't know where. I don't have the information on that, but she's holding one of her fabric pieces, well into her 90s at this point. She lived to 98 years old. And we end where we began. In 1978, this is Louise Bourgeois on the streets of New York, carrying one of her pieces. You know, are they spider eggs? Looks like it to me, but I don't know. Are they breasts? Is it about the nourishing? Is it about the devouring? I don't know. Your guess is as good as mine. The piece on the top is one of her pieces that is put together from one of the tapestries, basically the remnants of some of the fabric pieces that she saved and salvaged from her youth in the restoration field. I understand there was a lot of remnants and crazy things hanging around her studio. So there is a full film, The Spider, the Mistress, and the Tangerine, a modern artist and feminist icon, available on Canopy. It's about an hour and a half long. And then there's also this YouTube. There's other YouTubes that I didn't pull up, but this is a pretty good YouTube. It's relatively short, and it was from around the time when she had a show at the Tate Modern, I believe, in 2008. So, are there any questions at this point?
No, Larry, we don't have any questions. So,
okay.
I think, as you said, this was an overwhelming exhibit
Yes.
and talk. So I think everybody got enough information for them. So.
Yes. Okay. So the next time we're going to meet is going to be on the 20th at 2 o'clock. And basically what we're going to be doing is there is a upstate art event, which is going to be taking place on the weekend of the 28th and 29th at a bunch of venues upstate. I am going to go up and look at a couple of the shows. There's going to be a show at Olana, which is Frederick Church's estate up there, and there's going to be a contemporary show on inside the mansion there, and across the river in Catskill at Thomas Cole's estate, which is also open to the public. Thomas Cole is another Hudson River painter, and there's going to be the other half of that exhibit, which actually goes from historic Hudson River painters up to contemporary takes on the Hudson River. But there are venues, well over 60, in this event. So I will have a lot of information for you on that weekend, and recommendations. So there we go.
Before you go, Larry, we did get one question.
Yes.
When did she start making the large spiders? You know?
They began when she took the studio over in Brooklyn, I believe. So it was in the 80s, but the larger scale ones didn't happen. I don't think they happened until after the retrospective in 1983. So she really began in earnest to do them in the 1990s.
Okay. Well, thank you, Larry. This was a wonderful, informative program.
Interesting lady.
Certainly was. I just want to reiterate, if you want to go on our website to see everything that we offer, please go to chappaqua.library.org, which is our home site, and you could look at all the offerings of the library. So thank you, Larry, and have a nice weekend, everyone.